The military dog didn't bark. It didn't growl, didn't lunge, didn't do any of the things a trained canine was supposed to do when it entered a building at midnight with 4 federal handlers at its flanks. It moved through the emergency room at Hargrove Memorial Medical Center in Raleigh, North Carolina, silent and deliberate, its nose cutting low across the linoleum like a scalpel. It passed a man bleeding through a shoulder bandage. It passed a woman with an IV drip and a broken wrist. It passed a gurney, a supply cart, a cluster of exhausted residents who hadn't slept since Tuesday. And then it stopped, right in front of a nurse. She was 5 feet 4 inches, quiet-faced, wearing blue scrubs with a coffee stain near the left pocket. She was holding a medication chart and hadn't looked up yet. The dog sat down directly in front of her feet, not aggressive, not alarmed, just certain. The way dogs are certain when they've found exactly what they were sent to find. The nurse finally looked up. She looked at the dog, then at the handlers, then at the growing cluster of security personnel spilling through the ER doors, and she said, very calmly, "Your dog isn't detecting a threat, it's recognizing one." Nobody in that room understood what she meant. Not yet. Before this story is over, everything you think you know about this nurse is going to be wrong. Follow along until the very end, like this video, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Her name, the name on her badge, the name on her employment file, the name she'd used for 6 years without variation, was Jamie Voss. Charge nurse, ICU step-down unit, Hargrove Memorial Medical Center. 33 years old, no disciplinary record, strong evaluations. She showed up early, stayed late, rarely complained, and had an unsettling habit of noticing things other people missed. A patient's oxygen saturation dropping 2 points before the monitor alarmed. A medication interaction that 3 pharmacists had cleared but that she'd flagged anyway, correctly. 2 days later when the patient had a reaction. She was considered competent, reliable, forgettable, in the way that genuinely excellent nurses often are. The ones who don't perform their skill but simply exercise it, without announcement, in the direction of whoever needs it most. She was not considered exceptional. She was not considered remarkable. She was considered by most of the attending physicians on her floor as someone whose opinion was welcome when it confirmed their own and dismissible when it didn't. Dr. Warren Phelps had made that hierarchy clear within her first month at Hargrove. He was a senior attending in the ICU, mid-50s, well-credentialed, with the particular brand of confidence that comes from being right, often enough to forget the times you weren't. He ran a tight unit. He made decisions quickly, communicated in directives rather than conversations, and had a long documented history of interrupting nurses mid-sentence to redirect their observations through the filter of his own conclusions. With Jamie, he'd developed a specific shorthand. When she flagged something, he listened for approximately 4 seconds before either adopting it as his own idea or setting it aside with the 2-word dismissal. Not applicable. Already addressed. I'll look at it. She'd stopped pushing back within the first year, not because she'd stopped noticing things, but because she'd learned to route around him, documenting her observations carefully, raising concerns through charge notes and shift reports, building a paper trail that protected patients without requiring Phelps to acknowledge her directly. It was not a comfortable arrangement. It was a functional one. That night, the night the dog walked in, had begun like every other overnight shift. Jamie arrived at 11:40 p.m., 20 minutes early, with a paper cup of gas station coffee that was bad enough to keep her awake and cheap enough that she didn't feel guilty about wasting it. She took report from the outgoing charge nurse, a tired woman named Deb, who'd spent the last hour managing a post-surgical patient with escalating vitals, and 2 family members who kept trying to call in from the waiting room despite visiting hours being long over. "Mr. Okafor in 7 is still trending up on temp," Deb said, scrolling through the handoff notes. "Phelps ordered a new blood culture at 10. Results won't be back until morning. He said," and I'm quoting directly, "keep an eye on it and stop worrying." "That's not a clinical directive," Jamie said. "No," Deb agreed. "It's Phelps." Jamie took the report, clipped on her badge, and started her rounds. Hargrove Memorial was a mid-sized facility, not one of the sprawling academic medical centers that dominated the city's skyline, but solid, well-staffed, with a decent reputation for cardiac and post-surgical care. The overnight unit was quieter than days, lit in that particular washed-out fluorescent way that made everyone look slightly ill even when they weren't. The ER was one floor down and a world away. Louder, faster, organized around a different kind of chaos. She was on her second pass through the unit, checking on Mr. Okafor, when the radio at the nurse's station crackled with something that didn't make immediate sense. Federal team in the lobby, requesting access to patient floors, K9 unit. The unit secretary, a young man named Marcus, looked up from his screen with the particular expression people wear when they've heard something so unexpected that their brain hasn't fully processed it yet. Did they say K9? Clear it with administration, Jamie said, already moving back toward the station. It's midnight, Marcus said. I know. She was at the station when the elevator opened and they came in. 4 federal agents, 2 in tactical gear, 2 in dark jackets with agency credentials visible at their belts, and 1 Belgian Malinois on a short lead, moving with the focused efficiency of a dog that had been trained to find exactly one thing and was currently in the process of finding it. The lead agent, a woman in her 40s, short dark hair, posture like a closed door, spoke first. We need this floor cleared of non-essential personnel while we conduct a sweep. This is a federal security matter. I'm the charge nurse, Jamie said. This is an active patient care unit. I can't clear my floor in the middle of the night without understanding why. That's not a request, it's a directive. And this is a medical facility. My patients are on ventilators, IV drips, post-surgical monitoring. You can't sweep through here like it's an airport terminal without... We don't have time to explain the full scope to every... Then give me the relevant part. A beat. The agent studied her for a moment, the particular kind of look people give someone who is being unexpectedly difficult in a way they hadn't prepared for. There's been a threat assessment involving this facility. The dog is here to confirm or deny a specific signal. It takes 5 minutes. We'd appreciate your cooperation. You have my cooperation, Jamie said. You don't have my floor. The negotiation lasted another 90 seconds, during which Jamie did not raise her voice, did not back down, and did not stop watching the dog. It was already working, moving methodically, quartering the hallway outside the nurse's station, its nose skimming along the air in that particular way that meant it was tracking something specific rather than doing a general sweep. It came past the station entrance, past the medication cart, past the 2 residents who'd been doing chart review at the far end of the counter and had now gone completely still. And then it sat down. Right in front of Jamie, not aggressive, not indicating danger in the way the dog had been trained to indicate danger, not the alert posture that meant weapon or explosive or threat to neutralize, just sitting, looking up at her, certain. The lead agent's hand moved toward her radio. Step away from the nurse, said the second agent, the one who'd been quiet until now, male, younger, hand resting on something at his hip. Jamie didn't step away. She set down the medication chart she'd been holding, very deliberately, on the counter beside her. Your dog isn't detecting a threat, she said. It's recognizing one. Ma'am, I need you to... What's his name? She asked. The lead agent paused. Excuse me? The dog. What's his name? Another beat. The agent seemed thrown by the question, which was, Jamie suspected, at least partially the intention. Bricks. Jamie crouched down slowly, not fast, not sudden, hands visible, and looked at the dog directly. Bricks stared back. His ears were forward, relaxed. His breathing was steady. Hey, Bricks, she said quietly. The dog's tail moved once, not wagging, just acknowledgement. Jamie stood back up. He's not in distress. He's not alerting to a weapon or a compound. He's been trained for a specific task that isn't any of those things, and he found what he was looking for. She looked at the lead agent. Which means whatever you're actually doing here is more complicated than a threat assessment. And I think you should tell me what it is. Because in about 15 minutes, something else is going to happen in this building, and it's going to matter a great deal that I knew about it first. The silence that followed was the particular kind of silence that happens when someone says something they shouldn't know, and turns out to be right. The federal agents didn't tell her anything. What they did, instead, was request that she accompany them to a consultation room on the administrative level, framed as a voluntary request in the way that things framed as voluntary requests are rarely actually voluntary. Dr. Phelps, who had been paged in from home and arrived looking like a man who deeply resented the intrusion, met them in the hallway outside the elevator bank with his coat half-buttoned and the kind of expression that said he was already formulating the complaint he was going to file in the morning. "What exactly is going on?" he said, directed not at the federal agents, but at Jamie, as if she'd somehow engineered the situation. "I'm not sure yet," she said. "You're not sure?" He looked at the agents, at the dog, at the cluster of security personnel who'd materialized from the overnight shift. "Nurse Voss, if you've done something to trigger a federal response—" "She hasn't done anything," the lead agent, who had identified herself only as Agent Caldwell, said, in a tone that managed to be simultaneously helpful and dismissive. "We're conducting a routine assessment. We'd like a few minutes of her time." Phelps looked at Jamie the way he always looked at her when she was at the center of something he hadn't controlled the edges of, like she was a chart notation that didn't fit the diagnosis. "Fine, but I'd like to be present." "That won't be necessary," Caldwell said. "She's my staff member. She's an adult in a voluntary consultation. She doesn't require representation." Phelps's jaw tightened. He looked at Jamie again, waiting, she understood, for her to defer to him, to say, "It's fine, Dr. Phelps, I'll fill you in after," to restore the normal order of things in which her actions moved through his approval first. She didn't. "I'll be fine," she said. "Make sure someone covers Mr. Okafor while I'm off the floor. His temp was still trending up at midnight." Phelps blinked. Then, because there was nothing else he could do with federal agents standing in his hallway at 12:30 a.m., he nodded stiffly and stepped back. The consultation room was small. A table, 4 chairs, a window that looked out onto the parking structure. Caldwell sat across from Jamie. The second agent, who'd introduced himself as Ramos, stood near the door. Brick sat in the corner, still watching Jamie with that quiet, steady certainty. Caldwell opened a tablet, turned it so Jamie could see the screen, and said, "Do you recognize this?" The image was a military identification photograph. The woman in it was younger, early 20s, shorter hair, no softening around the edges that 6 years of civilian life had put there. The name below it read, James Victoria Ann, service number 4471 redacted. Status, KIA. Jamie looked at the photo for a long moment. Then she said, "Where did you get that?" "Is that you?" Caldwell asked. "Where did you get it?" Ramos moved slightly, which was the kind of movement that precedes someone putting a hand on someone else's arm. Jamie noticed it without looking at him. "I'm not running," she said. "I'm asking a legitimate question. That file should not exist. Not in its current form, not with a legible face, not accessible to any federal agency without a specific clearance level that neither of you has the seniority to hold." She paused. "So either someone above your pay grade sent you here knowing exactly what they'd find, or someone below it made a mistake that's going to cost them significantly." Caldwell's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A small recalibration, the kind that happens when you've planned for one kind of conversation and found yourself in a different one. "You're telling me you know what clearance level would be required to access that record?" "I'm telling you I know a great deal about that record," Jamie said, "because I'm the one who helped build the redaction protocols that were supposed to make sure it never showed up in a tablet at a midnight consultation in Raleigh, North Carolina." The room was quiet for a moment. Bricks made a small sound from the corner. Not a bark, just a breath, like punctuation. "Ms. Voss," Caldwell said finally, "or whatever your actual name is, we need to understand what we're dealing with here." "So do I," Jamie said. "Start talking." What Caldwell told her, in the clipped and carefully redacted version that federal agents give when they're sharing information they haven't been fully authorized to share, was this. 3 weeks earlier, a signals intelligence unit had picked up chatter referencing a location in the southeastern United States and a specific identifier, not a name, but a code designation that had been dormant for nearly 7 years. The kind of designation that gets attached to a person when that person's existence has been formally erased for operational reasons. The K9 unit had been part of a broader sweep, a verification protocol, essentially. Bricks had been trained not for explosives or narcotics, but for a specific biological marker, a rare compound that remained in the sweat and skin cells of individuals who had been exposed to a particular class of chemical agents used in classified theater operations. The exposure left a trace that was permanent, unremovable, and, to a dog trained to detect it, unmistakable. Jamie had known about bricks, not about this dog specifically, but about the program. She'd been briefed on it once, in a different life, in a room she wasn't supposed to be able to remember being in. She'd hoped the program had been discontinued. It hadn't. The chatter we intercepted, Caldwell continued, referenced this facility specifically, not by name, by a grid coordinate that corresponds to this building. The language suggested this location was going to be used as a site for something we haven't fully characterized yet, which is why we're here. What kind of something? That's what we're trying to determine. Jamie sat with that for a moment. Outside the window, the parking structure was empty, the overhead lights casting orange pools on concrete. A car moved through the exit lane, slow and quiet. "How long ago was the chatter?" she asked. 18 days. "And it took you 18 days to get here?" "It took us 18 days to get authorization to run bricks in a civilian facility," Caldwell said. "The clearance levels involved in verifying your designation are complicated," Jamie said. "Yes, I know." She thought about Mr. Okafor, 3 floors up, with a temperature that was still trending upward, and blood culture results that wouldn't be back until morning. She thought about the way Dr. Phelps had looked at her in the hallway. That particular look, the one that had become so familiar it had almost stopped registering. The look that said, "You're here to support, not to lead. You're here to implement, not to decide." She thought about the parking lot outside the window. The car that had moved through the exit lane was gone, but there had been something off about it. The way it moved, too slow, stopping for a moment near the structure's east pillar before continuing. A car moving too carefully at 12:30 a.m. in a hospital parking lot. She said, "I need to get back to my floor." "We're not done," Ramos said from the door. "I understand that. I need to get back to my floor." She stood up. "Someone needs to run a check on all utility access points in this building. I'm talking maintenance tunnels, HVAC system access, emergency generator housing, everywhere that has a connection to the central air handling for the patient floors." Caldwell stood as well. "Why?" "Because if someone has known for 18 days that I'm in this building," Jamie said, "and they sent chatter that was deliberately interceptable, they didn't do it to warn you. They did it to make sure you'd come here tonight, to this building, with limited personnel and a specific operational focus." She looked at Caldwell directly. "Someone used your verification protocol as a distraction, and whatever they're actually here to do, they've had 18 days to set it up." The silence that followed was different from the last one. This one had weight. She was back on the ICU step-down unit by 1:05 a.m., and the first thing she saw when she stepped off the elevator was Marcus standing at the nurse's station with the particular expression of someone who is trying not to alarm anyone while being genuinely alarmed. "Okay," he said quietly when she reached him. "We've got something weird." "Tell me." "Mrs. Tamboli in 4. Post-cardiac, stable all night. She started complaining about 15 minutes ago. Says she has a metallic taste in her mouth, and her left hand keeps going numb. I checked her vitals, everything reads fine. I paged Dr. Phelps, and he said, let me guess. He said it was probably anxiety and to document it." Jamie was already moving toward room 4. "Who else?" Marcus followed her. "That's the weird part. Mr. Okafor in 7 said almost the same thing, metallic taste, but I figured it might be a side effect of his antibiotics, and I—" "Who else?" A pause. "The patient in 11, Mr. Garrison. He's post-surgical. He's been sedated most of the night, but he started waking up about 20 minutes ago, and he was confused, disoriented, kept trying to pull his oxygen off." Jamie stopped walking. 3 patients, all on this side of the floor." "Yeah. Rooms 4, 7, and 11. "Yeah." She looked down the corridor, the rooms on the east side of the unit, the ones with windows that faced the back of the building toward the parking structure. "Marcus, I need you to do something for me right now. Don't page Phelps. Don't call administration. Go to the charge station and pull up the HVAC routing for this floor. Find out which air handling unit supplies the east side patient rooms." Jamie, right now, Marcus, please. He went. She continued to room 4. Mrs. Tamboli was 68 years old, 2 days post-cardiac catheterization, and had been tracking toward a completely uneventful recovery. She was sitting up in bed when Jamie entered, holding her own left hand like it belonged to someone else, a look on her face that mixed discomfort with embarrassment. "I know it sounds like I'm complaining," she said immediately. "You're not complaining," Jamie said, pulling the blood pressure cuff from the wall mount. "Walk me through it. When did the taste start?" "Maybe 40 minutes ago? I thought it was the dinner they brought. It was chicken, and the chicken tasted, I don't know, off. But then it got stronger. And my hand—" She flexed her fingers, watching them. "It's not numb exactly, more like there's pressure." Jamie cuffed her arm, took the reading, noted it. Then she pulled out her pen light and checked Mrs. Tamboli's pupils. Normal response, equal and reactive. She checked the patient's coordination, had her track a moving finger, asked her to squeeze both hands simultaneously. Left grip was measurably weaker. "Did you notice anything about the air in here tonight?" Jamie asked. "Any smell? Anything that seemed unusual about the room?" Mrs. Tamboli frowned. "I had the vent adjusted earlier. It was cold. I asked the night aide to redirect it. She did, and—" She stopped. "Actually, that was maybe 45 minutes ago, right around when I started to feel strange." Jamie looked at the ceiling vent above the bed. Standard issue HVAC grate, nothing visibly wrong with it. She stood on the step stool that lived in the corner of every patient room and looked more closely. There was something on the interior surface of the grate, a faint residue, barely visible, the kind of thing you'd never see if you weren't specifically looking for it. She got down off the stool. "Mrs. Tamboli, I'm going to move you to a different room. I'll explain in a moment, but right now I need you to come with me." "Is something wrong?" "I think the ventilation in this room may be causing some of your symptoms," Jamie said, keeping her voice even. "I want you somewhere else while we look at it. Can you walk?" "Of course I can walk," Mrs. Tamboli said, with the particular dignity of a 68-year-old woman who had survived a cardiac event and did not intend to be treated like she couldn't manage a hallway. Jamie got her up, got her moving, flagged the night aide at the far end of the corridor, and directed her to prep the unoccupied room on the west wing. Then she went to 7. Mr. Okafor was awake, which was not unusual given his trending fever, and confirmed the same metallic taste when Jamie said it had started maybe an hour ago, that he'd mentioned it to the aide who'd brought his midnight vitals and been told it was probably the antibiotics. He had no limb numbness, but his coordination was slightly off when she tested it. She moved him too. Garrison in 11 was the hardest. He was fighting the oxygen line and confused enough that it took Jamie and the overnight aide both to redirect him, calm him down enough to do a brief assessment, and get him transferred to a west side room without triggering a full desat alarm that would bring everyone running. By the time she had all 3 patients moved and had returned to the nurse's station, Marcus was back, pale-faced, holding a printed HVAC routing schematic. "The east side patient rooms," he said, "rooms 4 through 12. They're all on the same air handling unit, AHU3. Where does AHU3 draw external air from?" He pointed to the schematic. "Here, a rooftop intake on the east side of the building." "Which faces?" "The parking structure." Jamie looked at him for a moment. "Call security," she said. "Tell them I need someone at the east rooftop access right now. And then I need you to call Agent Caldwell. She gave me a card. It's at the station. And tell her what you just told me. All of it. The rooms, the patients, the symptoms, the HVAC unit." "What's happening?" Marcus asked. "Something is moving through this building," Jamie said, "and it's been moving through it for at least an hour." She was already heading for the stairwell when Dr. Phelps stepped out of the elevator, coat properly buttoned now, expression sharp, with the particular authority he put on when he wanted to reassert control of a situation that had moved without him. "Nurse Voss," he said, "I've been informed that you've been relocating patients without physician authorization. That is completely outside your— 3 patients on the east side of the floor are showing symptoms consistent with low-level chemical exposure," Jamie said, not stopping. "Metallic taste, peripheral numbness, and in Garrison's case, acute confusion. I've moved them to the west wing pending investigation of the HVAC unit servicing their rooms." Phelps stopped. Chemical exposure in this hospital. That's what I just said. That's... He shook his head, the expression shifting from authority to something that looked like it wanted to be dismissal but couldn't quite commit. That's an extraordinary claim. Yes, Jamie said. And you should probably call the attending physician of record for all 3 patients in the next 5 minutes. Because if I'm right, they're going to need labs and toxicology, and I'd rather that order comes from you than from me having to document that I asked and was ignored. She looked at him directly. Again. The again landed. She watched it land. Phelps's jaw tightened. Something moved across his face. Not quite recognition, but something adjacent to it. The awareness that the person in front of him was several steps ahead of where he'd assumed she was. I'll call it in, he said, quiet. Thank you. She went through the stairwell door. The stairwell smelled fine. No metallic quality, no trace of whatever was moving through the east side HVAC. She climbed to the roof access level, badge swiped through the security door, and stepped out into the Raleigh night air. The roof was flat and dark, lit only by the spillover of the parking structure's lights from across the access road. The rooftop mechanical units hummed steadily. She found the intake for AHU-3 without the schematic. She'd memorized the building layout months ago, the way she memorized everything she might need, quietly, without announcement, against the possibility of a moment exactly like this one. The intake grate had been opened and reclosed. The screws were new, and when she crouched down and looked inside, she could see, barely, in the spilled light from the structure across the road, a small cylindrical device attached to the interior wall of the intake shaft. She didn't touch it. She straightened up and looked out toward the parking structure. The car that had moved too slowly through the exit lane at 12:30 a.m. was parked in the shadows at the back of the second level. From this angle, she could see it clearly. Could see that the engine was running, the exhaust rising faint and white in the cold air. And she could see the silhouette of the person standing beside it, the person looking directly back at her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the figure raised something to their face, not a weapon, not immediately. And she realized, with the particular calm of someone who has been in moments like this before and knows that calm is the only currency that works, that it was a radio. Her own radio crackled at her hip, static. Then a voice, low, male, and carrying the particular flatness of someone who has removed all inflection to make what they're saying sound more certain than it is. You were supposed to stay retired, Voss, or whatever name you're using these days. She looked at the figure across the road for another moment. I am retired, she said into the radio. Then go back inside, get in your car, drive away. There are patients in this building who've been exposed to something through the Eastern HVAC system, she said. I'm not going anywhere. A pause. That's unfortunate, the voice said. And then the parking structure's lights went out. All of them. The entire east face of Hargrove Memorial went dark a half-second later. Not a flicker, not a gradual dimming, but the specific abrupt darkness of a power cut that someone planned. Below her, she heard the hospital's emergency generators kick in with a sound like a held breath finally released. And somewhere in the building beneath her feet, a patient monitor began alarming, high and urgent and continuous, in a way that meant someone had just crashed. Jamie was already moving. She took the stairs at a run, not the frantic, stumbling run of someone reacting to fear, the controlled, economical run of someone who has already decided where they're going and what they'll do when they get there. 3 flights down, badge swipe, through the door before it fully registered open, into the ICU step-down corridor where the emergency lighting had kicked in with that sickly amber cast that made everything look worse than it was, or sometimes exactly as bad as it was. Tonight, Jamie wasn't sure which. The alarming monitor was in room 9. She knew before she reached it because she'd memorized the room assignments when she'd taken report at 11:40, and Mr. Calloway in 9 had been the one patient Deb had flagged as stable, but watch him, post-CABG, day 3, the kind of recovery that looked clean on paper but had a way of hiding things in the numbers until the numbers stopped hiding them. She came through the door and took the room in one sweep. Calloway was in VFib. The monitor was screaming. The crash cart was in the corner where it always was. The overnight aide, a young woman named Petra, who had been with the unit for 4 months, was standing against the wall with her hands pressed flat to the surface behind her, like she was trying to push through it. "Get Dr. Phelps," Jamie said, already pulling the crash cart. "I paged him. Get him physically. Go." She didn't watch Petra leave. She was already cutting Calloway's gown, already placing the pads, hands moving through the sequence she'd run so many times that her body knew it before her mind finished the instruction. "Mr. Calloway." She pressed 2 fingers to his carotid. Nothing. She started compressions. "Sir, I need you to stay with me." He did not respond, which was not unexpected and was not the end of anything. She counted compressions, maintained rhythm, felt the particular physical reality of chest compressions, the resistance, the give, the way your shoulders start burning at about 30 seconds, if you're doing it right. And when she reached the right point, she delivered the shock. Calloway's body arced. The monitor flatlined for 1 long second, and then it found something. Irregular, stuttering, not what you wanted, but something. And she adjusted, checked his airway, repositioned his head, and delivered 2 rescue breaths through the mask she'd pulled from the cart before she'd even started compressions. The door opened behind her. She expected Phelps. She got Ramos. "What do you need?" he said. No preamble, no shock at the scene, just the flat readiness of someone who had been trained to walk into bad rooms. "Bag him," she said, nodding toward the mask. "I'll keep compressions. You maintain his airway until the attending gets here." He didn't hesitate. He crossed the room, took the bag valve mask, positioned himself at the head of the bed with a competence that told her he'd done it before. Not in a hospital, probably, but somewhere where the skill had mattered just as much. They worked in silence for 40 seconds. Then Calloway's rhythm shifted again, finding something more organized, something that looked almost like a sinus rhythm if you were generous with your interpretation. And when Jamie checked his carotid, she found a pulse. Weak, irregular, but present. "He's back," she said. "Yeah," Ramos agreed. He didn't sound relieved, exactly. He sounded like someone checking an item off a list. Phelps came through the door 30 seconds later with Petra behind him and 2 residents who'd been doing overnight chart review and had apparently followed the sound of the alarm. Phelps took 1 look at the monitor, 1 look at Jamie, and for a moment his expression did something complicated. The collision of a man who wanted to take charge of a situation that had already been handled by the person he'd been dismissing for 6 years. "V-fib conversion," he said. "Yes, 1 shock, resumed rhythm, approximately 90 seconds ago. Pulses present, but irregular. I'd want a 12 lead before we make any decisions about next steps." "I'll determine what we—" He stopped himself, looked at the monitor again. Then, with the particular difficulty of a man doing something that does not come naturally to him, he said, "Get the 12 lead." Jamie got the 12 lead. While she worked, she was also doing something else. Listening. To the building. To the sounds that lived underneath the alarm noise and the emergency generator hum, and the shuffling of too many people in a room that was designed for 1 patient and 2 staff. She was listening for the specific absence of sounds that mattered. The maintenance elevator on the east side, which she'd clocked as running every 40 minutes during her shift, had not run since the power cut. The secondary fire door at the end of the east corridor, which had a hydraulic mechanism that made a distinctive soft thud when it opened or closed, had thudded twice in the last 3 minutes. Someone was moving through the building. Not one of the evacuating patients, all of whom had been in rooms she'd accounted for. Someone who knew how to move without being seen, using the power cut as cover, using the alarm as noise. She finished the 12 lead, handed the strip to Phelps, and said, "I need to step out for 2 minutes. We're in the middle of— You have 2 residents and a federal agent in this room. You don't need me for the next 5 minutes, and I'll be back." She looked at him steadily. 2 minutes. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked down at the strip. She went. The east corridor was empty, which was wrong. Not because it should have been full of people. The patients had been moved. The overnight staff were concentrated around room 9. But because empty meant that the fire door had opened and closed, and whatever had come through it had gone somewhere. She moved down the corridor with her back to the wall on the right side, which put her in the shadow of the emergency lighting, which was exactly where she wanted to be. The supply room at the end of the corridor had a strip of light under the door that hadn't been there when she'd started her shift. She stood outside it for a moment, Through the door, she could hear the sound of someone moving things, methodical, not panicked, looking for something specific. She didn't have a weapon. She hadn't had one in 6 years and wasn't in the habit of thinking in those terms anymore, or hadn't been, until about an hour ago. What she had was the building, the specific knowledge of where things were, how they connected, what could be moved, and what couldn't. She had the crash cart in room 9, which contained epinephrine, atropine, and adenosine in concentrations that would do significant things to a person who was injected with them without consent and medical indication. But that wasn't a door she wanted to open. What she had also was the fire alarm pull station directly to her left. She looked at it. She thought about the calculations involved. The alarm would bring people. Ramos was already in the building. Caldwell's team was somewhere below. She'd seen them in the lobby when she'd come back from the roof. The person in the supply room would have to move. Movement meant exposure. Exposure meant options. She pulled the alarm. The building responded immediately. The alert klaxons, the strobes in the corridor lighting up in the emergency amber, the public address system clicking on with the automated evacuation instruction that played from a recording and therefore never sounded quite as urgent as it should. 40 feet away, she heard the supply room door open fast. The man who came out was not wearing a hospital uniform. He was wearing dark clothing and the kind of neutral, unspecific work jacket that could mean anything from maintenance technician to delivery driver to nothing in particular. He was medium height, well-built, and he stopped when he saw her. A full stop, the kind that happens when you've planned for an empty corridor and found it occupied. They looked at each other for approximately 1 second. Then he moved toward her, and Jamie made the decision she'd already made before she pulled the alarm. Because if she'd pulled it without having made the decision, she would have been doing it purely reactively, and reactive was not how she was built. She did not run. She stepped to her right, into the doorway of the linen closet, used the door frame for leverage, and when he came past her, she used his own momentum and 35 pounds of weight differential against him in the way she'd been taught by a woman who'd never once told her it was a technique that had a name. He went into the wall. Not hard enough to do anything permanent, hard enough to get him on the floor and give her the 2 seconds she needed to kick his right knee into a position it was not designed to occupy. He went down. He didn't go out. She hadn't been trying for that. But he went down and stayed down because the knee was genuinely not in a position it was designed to occupy, and she put her foot on his wrist where he was reaching for something she didn't want him reaching for, and she said, "Don't." He didn't. Ramos appeared at the end of the corridor at a run, took in the scene, and slowed to a walk. He looked at the man on the floor. He looked at Jamie. He opened his mouth and then appeared to reconsider whatever he was going to say. "Supply room," she said. "He was in there looking for something. You need to document everything he touched before anyone else goes in." Ramos pulled his radio. "Copy." He looked at her one more time. "You okay?" "Fine." She stepped back from the man on the floor, keeping her distance. "He's going to need his knee looked at." "He can wait," Ramos said. What followed was 2 hours of the specific organized chaos that happens when multiple crises converge in a space not designed to contain them. Federal agents swept the building in teams. The East Side HVAC was shut down, and a hazmat response team was dispatched from a facility 40 minutes outside Raleigh that Jamie suspected was not a civilian hazmat team at all, but something else operating under a civilian designation. 3 more patients on the floor reported the metallic taste, all of them in East Side rooms. All of them moved to the West Wing before their symptoms progressed to the neurological stage she'd seen in Garrison. Mr. Calloway remained in a modified sinus rhythm and was transferred to the cardiac ICU with a monitoring team and a set of orders that Phelps had written, and Jamie had, quietly, cross-checked for errors before they'd been implemented. She'd found one, a dosing calculation that was off by a decimal, and had corrected it in the electronic record with a note that attributed the change to a pharmacy verification flag. She did not tell Phelps. She was not sure if that was generous or dishonest, and she did not have the bandwidth to decide right now. At 3:15 a.m., Caldwell found her at the medication station where she was doing the documentation that had backed up during the crisis. The particular indignity of nursing work being that the paperwork doesn't stop even when the building is compromised and patients are crashing and someone is being detained by federal agents in the East Corridor. We've identified the device in the intake shaft, Caldwell said, without preamble. It's a slow-release compound dispersal system, timed to increase concentration at approximately 2 a.m. You're moving the patients and triggering the response when you did. She stopped, started again. The patients in those rooms would have been in significantly worse condition by now. Jamie kept typing. How many total devices? 2. One in AHU3 intake, one in the maintenance shaft that connects to the generator housing on the east face. The generator, Jamie said. She stopped typing. Not to release anything, to damage it. We believe so. So the power cut wasn't incidental. It was meant to trigger the generator. The generator was meant to be damaged. The hospital runs on emergency power with a compromised system, and in the confusion, she looked at Caldwell. The compound in the HVAC does the most damage because nobody's looking at patients. Everyone's dealing with the building systems. That's the working theory. It's not a theory, Jamie said. It's a sequence. And whoever planned it knew this building well enough to know which HVAC unit serves which patient rooms. Caldwell nodded once. That's what's concerning us. An insider. We're looking at access logs. Jamie went back to her typing. She could feel Caldwell still standing there, the particular presence of someone with more to say who is deciding how much to say it. Your file, Caldwell said finally. The operational record. We've been in contact with the relevant authority over the last 2 hours. And? And they're sending someone. Jamie's hand stopped on the keyboard. They've been trying to locate you for 8 months, Caldwell continued. Not for the reasons the people in that parking lot tonight would have you think. The program that erased your record, it wasn't fully authorized. There were elements of it that were... The language being used right now is irregular. People above the level of whoever authorized your erasure have been attempting to reconstruct what happened. Define reconstruct, Jamie said. Understand, document, and correct. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window at the end of the corridor, the Raleigh skyline was beginning to do the thing it did before dawn. The particular lightening of the eastern sky that wasn't sunrise yet, but was the memory of it, the suggestion. The people tonight, she said. The man in the corridor, the car in the parking structure. They knew I was here. Yes. Which means someone told them, before tonight, before you were sent. Caldwell's expression shifted. Just slightly, just enough. We're looking into that. You're looking into whether someone in your authorization chain, Jamie said carefully, leaked my location before you were even sent to verify it. Caldwell didn't confirm, didn't deny. The absence of both was its own answer. Jamie closed the documentation screen. She looked at her hands on the keyboard for a moment, the hands that had run compressions on Calloway 40 minutes ago, that had caught the man in the east corridor and put him on the floor, that had held Mrs. Tamboli's arm while she guided her out of a contaminated room and kept her voice steady and her face neutral so the woman wouldn't be frightened. Who's coming? Jamie asked. I don't have a name. I have a rank. Caldwell paused. Colonel. That's all I was told. Jamie had served under 3 colonels in her previous life. One had been brilliant, one had been competent, and one had been the reason her record existed the way it did. Erased, redacted, stamped KIA over a face that was still very much alive. She did not ask which one. She suspected she already knew. When? She said. Estimated arrival, 6 a.m. She looked at the clock on the wall above the medication station. 3:22 a.m. 2 hours and 38 minutes. Then I have work to finish, she said. She pulled the documentation screen back up and kept typing. Caldwell stood there for another moment. Then she left, because there was nothing else to do with someone who had just been told their past was arriving in a car in 2.5 hours, and had responded by returning to their paperwork. The rest of the night was not quiet. Nights in hospitals after federal incidents were never quiet. There was always the paperwork and the debrief forms and the incident reporting and the administrator who arrived at 4 a.m. looking like he'd been pulled out of a dinner party and wanted everyone to know it, but it was managed. Jamie managed it. She updated charts, coordinated with the hazmat team on the patient exposure documentation, checked on all 3 original patients twice more, and at 4:45 a.m. stood over Mr. Okafor's bed while he slept. Finally, actually slept, The fever broken now that he'd been moved out of the compromised room and his antibiotic dose had been adjusted, and allowed herself 30 seconds of something that was not quite relief, but was adjacent to it. He was going to be fine. All three of them were. Phelps found her in the break room at 5:15 a.m. She was standing at the counter with a cup of the unit's coffee, which was better than the gas station coffee she'd arrived with, but not by much. And she hadn't sat down because she'd learned a long time ago that sitting down when you were exhausted meant committing to the exhaustion in a way that made the next 4 hours significantly harder. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She could hear him doing it, the particular quality of someone's presence when they're deciding something. "The decimal error in Calloway's orders," he said. She didn't turn around. "What about it?" "The pharmacy flag. They told me it cleared automatically on their end, which means it didn't come from them." She drank her coffee. "I've been doing this for 23 years, Phelps said. "I've made that calculation in my sleep. Everyone makes errors when they're tired and the building is in a crisis." "I know." A pause. "You could have just told me." "Would it have been faster?" she asked. Not unkindly, just specifically. The silence that followed was not comfortable, but it was honest, which was something. "The federal agents," Phelps said finally. "They're not telling us everything." "No," Jamie agreed. "Are you going to?" She turned around then. He looked older at 5 a.m. than he did during the day. Not weak, just reduced to something more accurate. The performance of authority he maintained on rounds had nowhere to stand in a break room at dawn, and without it, he was just a man in a partially buttoned coat who'd driven to a hospital in the middle of the night and found a situation he couldn't control. She almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "Someone used this hospital tonight," she said. "Not randomly. Specifically. They knew the building. They knew the patient layout. They knew which systems to target. That means either they had very good information or they had someone on the inside who gave it to them." Phelps went still. "Inside this hospital?" "I don't know yet, but when the investigation moves forward, they're going to be looking at access logs and personnel files, and anyone who had detailed knowledge of the East Side utility systems in the last several months. That's..." He stopped. "That's a lot of people." "Yes." She finished her coffee. "You should probably call your administrator in before 6 a.m. There are things he needs to know before the federal briefing." She put the cup in the sink and went back to her floor. At 5:52 a.m., she was at the nurse's station reviewing the shift handoff notes when Marcus, who had been quiet for the last 2 hours, with the particular quiet of someone processing a great deal, looked up from his screen and said, "Someone's coming up from the lobby. Wasn't announced. Security just called to say they cleared a military ID." Jamie looked at the elevator. The doors opened at 5:58 a.m. The man who stepped out was in his late 50s, wearing civilian clothes that sat on a military frame. The way civilian clothes always did on people who'd spent 20 years in uniform. Slightly wrong, slightly too deliberate. He was gray at the temples, straight-backed, and he moved through the corridor toward the nurse's station with the particular ease of someone who had been in enough difficult rooms to have stopped being affected by the atmosphere of them. He stopped in front of the station. He looked at Jamie, and the color left his face. Not dramatically, not the theatrical pallor of someone receiving a shock in a film. Just a subtle, specific draining, the kind that happens when the thing you've been afraid might be true turns out to be worse than you'd prepared for. "Voss," he said. Jamie looked at him for a long moment. She had served under 3 colonels. She recognized this one. "Colonel Harlan," she said. The name dropped into the space between them like something falling from a great height. Marcus, who had been pretending to look at his screen, was very clearly not looking at his screen. "I was told you'd been located," Harlan said. "I wasn't told..." He stopped. Started again. "I wasn't told you were here in this capacity." 6 years, Jamie said. "I know." "You signed the authorization," she said. "The one that changed my status." Harlan looked at her. His jaw moved. He was doing the calculation that powerful men do when they're confronted with the evidence of a decision they'd made, the assessment of whether to explain, to deny, to apologize, or to do something else entirely. He did none of those things. What he said was, "There's something you need to know about tonight." about why they came here specifically. They came here because someone told them where I was, Jamie said. Yes, he exhaled. And the person who told them, the person who leaked your location before we could run the verification and bring you in safely. He paused. They're still in this building. The break room door was still open at the end of the corridor. Jamie had left Phelps there 8 minutes ago. She looked at Harlan. He looked back. And in the silence between them, 3 floors below, the hospital's main entrance doors opened and 2 more people walked in. Neither of them announcing themselves, neither of them checking in at security, moving directly toward the elevator bank with the focused certainty of people who had been here before. The elevator indicator light began to climb. Jamie was already moving before the elevator indicator hit 2. Who else came in with you? She said to Harlan, not stopping, heading for the stairwell door. No one from my team. He fell into step beside her, and she noted that he kept pace without asking where they were going, the reflex of a man who'd spent decades following situations rather than managing them from a distance. The 2 people in the lobby, I don't know who they are. Yes, you do, she said. A pause. Yes, he admitted. I do. She pushed through the stairwell door and started down. Kellerman's people. The silence that followed confirmed it. Deputy Director Aaron Kellerman. She hadn't spoken that name in 6 years, hadn't allowed herself to, the way you don't allow yourself to think about a specific pressure point when you're trying to function, because thinking about it makes it real, and real makes it something you have to deal with, and dealing with it requires a version of yourself you deliberately put away. Kellerman had been the one above Harlan, the one who had approved the operation that was supposed to be her last, the one who had, when the operation went sideways and she'd survived something she wasn't supposed to survive, decided that the cleanest solution was to make sure the record said she hadn't. She'd understood the logic at the time. She still understood it. That didn't mean she'd forgiven it. How long has he known I was here? She said. I don't know exactly. Estimate. Weeks, possibly longer. Harlan's voice was tight. Kellerman has assets in the Signals Intelligence Unit that flagged your designation. He knew about the chatter before I did, before Caldwell was authorized to run the verification. She stopped on the landing between the 3rd and 2nd floors, turned to look at him in the stairwell's emergency lighting, which was doing no favors to either of their faces. He sent the chatter, she said. Kellerman generated the intercept that triggered the verification. Harlan looked at her steadily. That's what I believe. He created the operational justification to get federal assets into this building tonight. Made sure the response team would be small, the timeline compressed, the authorization chain complicated enough that no one would have full situational awareness. She worked through it as she said it. And while everyone was focused on the HVAC devices and the power cut and the man in the East Corridor, his people walked through the front door with military credentials that would clear any security check. And do what? She said. What's the actual objective? Harlan was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who didn't know, the quiet of someone deciding how much of what they knew to hand over. There's a witness, he said finally. Someone who was part of the same operation you were, who survived, like you did, and who has spent the last 8 months providing documentation to an oversight committee reviewing the authorization chain for that mission. He paused. Documentation that names Kellerman specifically. And the witness is here, Jamie said, in this hospital. Admitted 6 days ago, cardiac event, genuine, not staged, room 14, East Wing, cardiac step-down. He met her eyes. Your unit, Voss. Room 14 had been occupied by a man named Walter Greer, 61 years old, admitted for a non-ST elevation MWA and a subsequent catheterization. She'd checked on him twice during her shift. He'd been quiet, watchful, with the particular stillness of someone accustomed to making himself unnoticeable. She'd attributed it to the natural introversion of a man recovering alone without family visitors. She started moving again. Yeah. The second floor was louder than it should have been. The federal sweep teams had consolidated to the lobby and the east utility areas, leaving the patient floors with their regular overnight staff, reduced, distracted, running on emergency lighting and frayed attention. The cardiac step-down unit shared a corridor with the general medical floor, and the unit secretary had abandoned the station to help redirect a confused post-surgical patient who'd been trying to leave through the fire exit in the alarm chaos. Room 14 was at the end of the hall. The door was slightly open, which was not how she'd left it on her last check. Jamie held up one hand behind her. Harlan stopped. She moved the last 20 feet alone, back to the wall, and looked through the gap before she pushed the door fully open. Walter Greer was in his bed, upright, with the focused stillness of someone who was not asleep and had not been asleep and knew something was wrong. His telemetry leads were still attached. His IV was intact. Across the room, standing near the window with a tablet in one hand and a very specific posture, was a woman in dark civilian clothing whose hospital visitor badge was the wrong format. One of the ones issued at the main desk downstairs, the kind that printed in under 60 seconds and required no real verification. Jamie opened the door the rest of the way. The woman turned. She was early 40s, composed, with the particular careful blankness of someone trained to show nothing in their expression while calculating a great deal behind it. "Nurse," she said, with the slightly elevated friendliness that people use when they want to appear unconcerned, "I was just checking on my uncle." "You're not his family," Jamie said. "He doesn't have any listed contacts. I checked his admission paperwork on intake." The composure didn't crack, but it recalibrated, just slightly. The woman's eyes moved to the door, to Harlan, who'd appeared behind Jamie, and back. "Step away from the patient," Jamie said. "You're not in a position to—" "I'm the charge nurse on this floor, and you're in a patient room without verified authorization during an active federal security response. That makes me exactly the right person." She kept her voice level, the same voice she used when a patient was agitated. Not placating, not aggressive, just absolutely certain of its own authority. "Step away from the patient and put the tablet down." Greer spoke from the bed, his voice rough and deliberate. "She came in 10 minutes ago, said she was hospital administration. She's been trying to access my phone." The woman's expression completed its shift, from composed to something harder, something that had given up on the pretense. She looked at Jamie with the particular assessment of someone deciding whether to push through or find a different route. She chose a different route. She moved toward the window. Not the door, the window, which told Jamie something specific about how she'd planned to exit, because the room was on the second floor and the east face had the metal maintenance ladder that ran from the roof access down to the generator housing service platform. Jamie reached the window first. Not gracefully. She clipped the IV stand on the way past, and it went over, and she caught it with one hand while the other went to the window latch, and she got there with maybe 2 seconds of margin and threw the latch before the woman's hand reached it. What followed was not elegant. The woman was trained, and Jamie had a bruised shoulder from the East Corridor interaction, and neither of them had room to do anything properly in a 10 by 12 patient room with a cardiac patient in a bed that couldn't be moved. Harlan was in the doorway and couldn't get past without making it worse. Greer, who apparently had some relevant background of his own, grabbed the woman's wrist from the bed with a grip that was remarkable for someone who'd had a cardiac catheterization 4 days ago. She went down. Not out. Greer didn't have the leverage, and Jamie was running on adrenaline and fumes. But down and restrained, face down on the linoleum with Jamie's knee in her back, and Harlan finally through the door and kneeling beside them. "I've got her," he said. Jamie stood up. Her shoulder was unhappy about the last 3 minutes. She ignored it. She looked at Greer. His telemetry was alarming. She could hear it from here, the rhythm elevated but not critical. His face was gray and damp, and his left hand was pressed to his chest in the involuntary way that meant he was feeling something he was trying to assess. "Rate your pain," she said immediately at the bedside. 1 to 10. 4, he said. Maybe 5. "Pressure or sharp?" "Pressure. Same as before." She checked his radial pulse. Elevated, irregular. Not what she wanted from a man 4 days post-catheterization who had just spent 10 minutes in a room with someone trying to access his phone and had then grabbed that person's wrist from a hospital bed. She pulled the call light. "I need you to lie back," she said. "You're going to feel worse if you stay upright while your heart's doing this." "I know," he said. He didn't move for a moment, still watching the door, watching Harlan, watching the woman who was now in zip restraints and breathing hard on the floor. Then, slowly, he lay back. She copied something, he said. Off the phone, before you came in. Jamie looked at the tablet on the floor, which had slid under the radiator in the struggle. What was on your phone? The access codes for the committee server, Greer said, the one hosting the documentation. He closed his eyes briefly. If Kellerman has those codes, he can get in before the committee reconvenes Monday. He can alter or delete. He stopped, pressed his lips together, opened his eyes. It took me 8 months to build that record. The corridor outside filled suddenly with sound, running footsteps, Caldwell's voice carrying over the radio traffic, the particular frequency of a situation that had just been escalated from contained to active. Jamie looked at Harlan. He was watching her with the expression of a man who had understood, sometime in the last 40 minutes, that he was not the most capable person in the room and was adjusting to that information with something between discomfort and relief. The tablet, she said, if she transmitted, did it go through? She looked at the woman on the floor. Hospital Wi-Fi requires device registration. She'd have needed the guest network, and the guest network has been down since the power cut. Harlan looked at the woman. The woman said nothing, which was its own answer. The copy's still on the tablet, Jamie said, and whoever sent her here knows she hasn't transmitted it yet. Which means they're going to send someone else, Harlan said, or come themselves. Caldwell arrived in the doorway with 2 agents, took in the room in one sweep, and immediately stationed one agent outside and moved the other to assist with the woman on the floor. She looked at Jamie with an expression that had moved well past surprise into something more like resignation, the face of someone who had come in expecting a verification exercise and was now 3 hours into a different kind of night entirely. We have a problem, Caldwell said. More than one, Jamie said. But what's yours? Kellerman is in the building. The corridor went quiet. Even the footsteps seemed to pause. He arrived 12 minutes ago, Caldwell continued. Cleared security with his deputy director credentials. I didn't know he was coming, and I don't have the authority to detain him without... She stopped. The institutional constraint of it sat on her face like something heavy. He outranks me by a significant margin. Where is he now? Harlan asked. He went to the administrative level. He's requested a room for a briefing. Caldwell looked at Jamie directly. He's asking for you specifically, by name. Not by Voss, not by the nurse. By name, which meant the name on the badge, the constructed identity, the 6 years of careful distance from everything that name had been built to replace. He knows I'm here, Jamie said. He knew before we did, Caldwell said. The monitor above Greer's bed alarmed again. A different tone this time, the one that meant the rhythm had shifted. Jamie turned, checked the readout, and made a rapid assessment. His blood pressure was dropping and the irregular rhythm was organizing itself into something she didn't want to see on a post-cath patient in an already compromised state. She hit the call button again, hard. I need a physician in room 14 right now, she said into the intercom. Possible post-procedural complication, telemetry showing. She read the rhythm, then she looked at Harlan. Get Caldwell's team into a room where Kellerman can't walk into it. The tablet doesn't leave this floor and it doesn't leave federal custody. She turned back to Greer, already reaching for the emergency supply drawer. I'll deal with Kellerman when this patient is stable. He's not going to wait, Harlan said. Then he can come to the room, Jamie said, because I'm not leaving this patient. Harlan left. Caldwell left. The agent by the door stayed. Jamie worked. She worked in the focused, economical way she always worked, drawing meds, adjusting the monitoring leads, talking to Greer in the low, steady voice that meant I know what's happening, and I know what to do about it. And in the back of her mind, she was running a parallel track, the one that had been running since she'd seen Brick sit down in front of her at midnight, and had understood, in the space of one held breath, that the life she'd built here was about to be taken apart. The physician who arrived, a young cardiac fellow named Dr. Osai, not Phelps, someone she'd worked with twice and found competent and direct, took the handoff cleanly and moved immediately to stabilize. Jamie stayed until the rhythm improved. 4 minutes, maybe 5. Then she stepped back. She had left her coffee in the break room. She had documentation on 4 patients that was 8 hours out of date. She had a bruised shoulder. A man upstairs who had orchestrated the erasure of her identity waiting in an administrative conference room, and a building that had been used as a weapon against at least one of the people she was responsible for keeping alive. She straightened her scrubs, checked her badge, walked to the elevator. When the doors opened on the administrative level, the corridor was empty except for one figure standing at the far end, tall, silver-haired, in a dark suit that had never been near anything as inconvenient as a hospital at 6 in the morning. He stood with the particular stillness of a man who expected rooms to organize themselves around him. He turned when the elevator opened. They looked at each other across the length of the corridor. "Victoria," Aaron Kellerman said. He used the name from the photograph, the name that predated everything she had built and everything she had survived. "You have the wrong name," Jamie said. "I have the only one that matters." He took 2 steps toward her, slow and unhurried. "And I think it's time we had a conversation about what happens next." "Agreed," she said. She walked toward him, and she did not slow down, and she did not look away. Behind her, the elevator doors closed, and in the stairwell 2 floors below, a door opened that no one had authorized, and heavy footsteps began to climb. The footsteps in the stairwell kept climbing. Jamie heard them the way she'd learned to hear things that mattered, not by stopping to listen, but by registering them in the background of everything else she was doing, like a second process running beneath the first. She was walking toward Kellerman and counting the steps simultaneously, heavy, unhurried, spaced with the particular rhythm of someone who was not rushing because they didn't believe they needed to. Kellerman heard them too. His eyes moved to the stairwell door at the far end of the administrative corridor, then back to her. He hadn't moved from his position, still standing with that particular quality of stillness that powerful men develop when they've spent decades in rooms where stillness meant authority. "You should know," he said as she closed the distance between them, "that whatever Colonel Harlan has told you tonight, his understanding of the situation is incomplete." "That seems to be a recurring theme," Jamie said. "People having incomplete understanding." "Meaning?" "Meaning Harlan didn't know you generated the intercept. Caldwell didn't know you were coming. The agents who responded tonight didn't know the full scope of what they were walking into." She stopped about 8 feet from him. "You built this operation on layered ignorance. Everyone knew just enough to do their part and not enough to see the whole shape of it." Something moved in Kellerman's expression. Not surprise, but acknowledgement. The slight adjustment of a man who had expected to manage this conversation and was recalibrating to the version of it that was actually happening. "You were always the sharpest analyst in that unit," he said. "I told Harlan that repeatedly. And then you had my record altered, and my status changed to KYA. That decision was more complicated than—" "I know exactly how complicated it was," she said. "I've had 6 years to work through the complications. What I want from you right now is not an explanation. I want to know who's coming up that stairwell." The door opened before he could answer. The man who stepped through it was broad-shouldered, somewhere in his late 40s, in civilian clothing that fit him the way clothing fits someone who is accustomed to wearing a uniform and finds everything else slightly constraining. He had a security badge, one of the administrative-level access badges, not a visitor tag, clipped to his jacket, and he carried himself with the specific assurance of someone who believed that their presence in any room was automatically authorized. He looked at Jamie and stopped. "Voss," he said. She recognized him. Not immediately. 6 years erased some of the specificity, but the architecture of his face was familiar in the way that people who've been in high-stress situations with you become familiar, burned into a particular register of memory that civilian life doesn't overwrite cleanly. His name was Denton. He'd been Kellerman's operational coordinator during the mission, the one who handled the field logistics, the one who'd given the order that had put her in the situation from which she was supposed to not have survived. "Major Denton," she said. "Not anymore." He glanced at Kellerman. "Sir, we have a problem downstairs." "I'm aware of the problems downstairs," Kellerman said. "Come in and close the door." Jamie looked between them. The administrative corridor was empty. Caldwell and Harlan were 2 floors below. The night administrator had been in his office at the far end of the hall the last time she'd seen him, and whatever security Kellerman had arrived with was not visible. She was alone in a hallway with 2 men whose combined interest in her continued existence was, at best, complicated. She'd been in worse positions. This was objectively true. It did not make the current position comfortable. "The tablet's been secured," she said to Denton, because she wanted to see his reaction. "Your colleague didn't transmit before she was detained." His jaw tightened. "That's a temporary situation." "The codes change automatically every 6 hours," she said. "The committee's IT protocol. Greer told me." This was not true. Greer had said no such thing, and she had no way of knowing if the codes cycled or not. But she watched Denton's face and saw the calculation run across it, the uncertainty, the reweighing of the timeline. Kellerman watched her do it. A small, humorless expression passed over his face. "You're still very good at that." "At what?" "Managing information in real time." "I'm a charge nurse," she said. "It's the whole job." A door opened behind her. She heard it, turned instinctively, put the wall to her right and both men in her sightline. It was the night administrator, a man named Bertram Solis, who had arrived in his office at 4 a.m., still wearing what appeared to be a very nice dinner jacket over a rumpled dress shirt, and had been alternating between outrage and panic ever since. He came out of his office now with a phone pressed to his ear and stopped when he saw the configuration of people in his corridor. Is this the federal briefing?" he said, confused. "Yes," Kellerman said smoothly. "If you could give us a few more minutes?" "No," Jamie said. Solis looked at her. "Mr. Solis, this man," she indicated Kellerman, "is not here as part of the authorized federal response. He arrived independently with military credentials, and he has not been cleared by the agents managing tonight's incident. I'd strongly suggest you call Agent Caldwell right now and confirm whether his presence in this building has been authorized by the response team." The silence that followed had texture. Kellerman's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. Not retreat, not yet, but the first acknowledgement that the room had more variables than he'd planned for. Solis looked at his phone, then at Kellerman, then at Jamie, with the expression of a man who had never once in his administrative career been the deciding factor in anything that mattered, and was now deeply uncertain whether he wanted to be. I'll call Agent Caldwell," he said. "Thank you," Jamie said. Solis retreated into his office, and the door clicked shut. Denton moved, not toward her, toward the stairwell, and she understood immediately what he was doing, because she'd been tracking the building's exits in her head since midnight, and the stairwell he'd come up from connected to the second-floor cardiac unit and Walter Greer's room and the tablet that hadn't transmitted yet. "Denton," Kellerman said sharply. He stopped. "This doesn't need to be a secondary operation," Kellerman said. The authority in his voice was the kind that had been exercised so long it had become structural, something people responded to before they'd consciously processed it. "Voss," he turned to her. "6 years ago, a decision was made that I stand by. The operation was compromised. The intelligence you carried out of that theater, if it had surfaced through legitimate channels at that time, people would have died. People who were still operational. I made the only call that protected the mission and the people still in the field." "By listing me as dead," Jamie said, "by removing you from a situation that was unmanageable," he said, "you were extracted. You were given resources. I was given a new name and left," she said flatly. "In Raleigh, without debrief, without support, without any acknowledgement that I'd survived something I wasn't supposed to survive. I built this," she looked briefly down at the badge on her scrubs, "out of nothing. 6 years of nothing." "And you built it well," Kellerman said, and something in his voice was almost, not quite, but almost genuine. "Which is exactly why you understand what's at stake. The documentation Greer assembled doesn't tell the full story. It takes operational decisions out of context and frames them as misconduct. If that record reaches the committee on Monday, people will be held accountable," Jamie said, "for decisions that had consequences that extended far beyond the operational calculus you used to justify them." "People will be prosecuted," Kellerman said, "incorrectly, incompletely, on the basis of a partial record compiled by a man with an agenda." "Greer served in the same unit I did," she said. "He was listed KYA for 14 months. His agenda is the same as mine." Your agenda, Kellerman said, is to go back to your patients, which you can do. Tonight can end here, Voss. The devices in the HVAC have been recovered. The man in the East Corridor is in custody. My people leave the building, the documentation stays incomplete, and you keep being someone who doesn't exist, she said. Keep being someone who's safe. She looked at him for a long moment. 6 years ago, she had understood the logic. She'd said that to herself already tonight, multiple times, and it was still true. Aaron Kellerman was not a stupid man or a sadistic one. He was a man who had made a decision within a framework that valued operational outcomes over individual cost, and had spent 6 years since then managing the consequences of that decision. Not because he regretted it, but because the consequences kept generating new problems. She was the newest problem. You built this entire operation tonight, she said, to recover a tablet in room 14 and remove a witness from a committee record. You introduced a chemical agent into a civilian hospital. You cut the power to a building with patients on ventilators and cardiac monitors. Mr. Calloway coded tonight. He's alive because I moved the crash cart before the power cut, but he coded, and his outcome was not guaranteed, and none of that was part of your operational calculus. Kellerman's expression was unchanged. That was the tell. Not guilt, not discomfort, just the flat, steady recognition of a man who had already done the math and accepted the numbers. That's why you have to be stopped, Jamie said. Not because of what you did to me, because of what you're willing to do to people who have nothing to do with any of this. She pulled out her phone. What are you doing? Denton said. Calling Agent Caldwell, she said, and sending her a voice memo I've been recording since you said my name in this corridor. Kellerman moved fast for a man his age. She'd give him that, but she'd positioned herself with the wall to her right and had started toward the administrator's office door the moment she saw his weight shift, so when he reached for the phone, she was already past him, shoulder down, through Solis's office door before either of them closed the gap. Solis was on his office phone and looked up with an expression of pure alarm as she came through his door and pushed it shut and put her back against it. Call security, she said. Right now. I'm already... Not Caldwell, building security. I need someone physically in this corridor in the next 60 seconds. Denton hit the door from the other side. The door was a standard interior door set. Not heavy, not reinforced, and it wasn't going to hold long. She braced her weight against it and looked at Solis, who had the phone to his ear and was doing the thing that people do in crises when their role is administrative, trying to find the right procedure for a situation that doesn't have one. Tell them there's an altercation on the administrative level, she said. Tell them now. He told them. His voice shook slightly, which was understandable. The pressure against the door stopped. She waited 3 seconds. Then she moved to the side window of the office, interior-facing, looking out into the corridor, and checked the angle. Kellerman was standing in the center of the hallway, phone to his ear, speaking in the clipped low tones of someone making a call they didn't want overheard. Denton was not visible, which was worse than him being visible. She sent the voice memo. 22 seconds later, her phone vibrated. Caldwell. Received. Stay put. She did not stay put, because Denton not being visible meant Denton was somewhere in this building doing something, and the only things in this building worth doing from Kellerman's perspective were the tablet in room 14 and Walter Greer in the same room, and Dr. Osai was with Greer and was not a person equipped for what Denton represented. She went out through Solis's secondary door, the one that connected to the back administrative corridor, which she'd noted on her first week because she always noted secondary exits, and took the stairs. The second floor was loud in a different way than it had been 40 minutes ago. There were more agents, more movement, the particular organized urgency of a federal response that had received new information and was reallocating. She saw Caldwell at the far end of the corridor, speaking to 2 agents with the clipped authority of someone who has just been handed something significant and is converting it into action. She saw Harlan near the nurse's station, looking at his phone with the expression of a man reading something that was confirming things he'd hoped weren't true. She didn't see Denton. Room 14's door was closed. She went to it, knocked twice, the knock she used for patient rooms, the professional knock that was both announcement and entry, and opened it. Dr. Osei looked up from the monitor beside Greer's bed. Greer was upright again, which she was going to address, but he was upright because he was looking at someone standing near the window. Denton. He'd come down a different way, the secondary administrative stair, which she hadn't covered because she'd been in Solace's office. He was standing near the window with the tablet in his hand, and the window was open, and the maintenance ladder on the east face was right there. Osei had the expression of someone who had been told very recently and very firmly to stay out of the way and had not yet determined whether or not to comply. "Dr. Osei," Jamie said, keeping her voice flat and even, "I need you to step into the corridor." "She stays," Denton said. "She's a physician with no part in this situation. She goes." Osei looked between them. Then she went, because she was a smart woman and the room had a quality that smart people recognize and correctly evacuate. The door clicked shut. Denton looked at Jamie across the room. Greer watched from the bed with the focused stillness he'd had all night. The stillness, she now understood, of a man who had been in dangerous rooms before and knew that stillness was currency. "The tablet's transmitting now," Denton said. "Hospital guest network's back up since the generator stabilized. Whatever your nurse friend said about cycling codes, she was improvising." Jamie noted that he'd said it, noted what the saying of it revealed, that he'd been close enough to hear her in the corridor, which meant he'd been in the stairwell before she'd seen him come through the door, which meant the footsteps had been deliberate. He'd wanted to be seen. He'd wanted her focused on the corridor while he went around. She looked at the tablet in his hand. The screen was lit. She could see it from here, could see the connectivity indicator, could see the small rotating icon that meant data was moving. "How long?" she said. 2 minutes, maybe less. The committee's access logs will show an unauthorized upload from an unsecured network during an active federal security incident at this facility, she said. "That's not evidence suppression. That's evidence tampering, and the upload will be flagged automatically." "By the time it's flagged, the original's still on Greer's phone," she said. Denton stopped. "The woman in room 14 earlier," Jamie said. "She copied the access codes. She didn't copy the documentation itself. The source files are still on the device." She looked at Greer. "Am I wrong?" "You're not wrong," Greer said quietly. Denton's expression ran through something, the rapid internal revision of a plan that had just developed a structural problem. The tablet transmission wasn't a backup. It was supposed to be a replacement. Flood the committee server with corrupted or altered data using the legitimate access codes, making it look like Greer himself had modified the record. If the original files were still on Greer's phone unaltered, the transmission created a discrepancy that would not help Kellerman's case. It would demonstrate that the server-side record had been tampered with. She watched him understand this. "Give me the phone," he said to Greer. "No," Greer said. "Give..." The door opened behind Jamie. She moved left immediately, reflex putting herself out of the direct line, and Ramos came through, with 2 agents behind him, and stopped when he saw the configuration of the room. "Federal agents," Ramos said. "Sir, put the tablet on the bed and step away from the window." Denton looked at the tablet, at the window, at the ladder 3 feet away from him. The calculation ran across his face in real time. The distance, the agents, the tablet still transmitting, the phone on Greer's bedside table. He put the tablet on the bed. He did not step away from the window. He stepped through it. Ramos moved fast and was 2 seconds too slow. Denton was on the ladder, moving down, and the agents at the window looked at Ramos, and Ramos said something sharp into his radio, and one of them went out the window after him. Jamie picked up the tablet from the bed. The transmission was at 64%. She looked at the connectivity indicator and then at the power button and held it down until the screen went dark. The room was quiet for a moment. Greer exhaled. He looked at his phone on the bedside table, small, scratched, the kind of phone that looked unremarkable because it was supposed to. And he set his hand over it, not gripping, just resting. "He'll be caught," Ramos said from the window, watching the ladder. "Probably," Jamie said. "That's not reassuring," Greer said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She looked at his monitor. His rhythm had settled, still elevated but organized. "Lie back. You've had a significant amount of physical stress for someone 4 days post-catheterization, and I need to check your troponin levels before I'm willing to say you're fine." "I'm not fine," Greer said, but he lay back. Awesome. What happened in the next 2 hours was less cinematic than what had preceded it, which was the nature of institutional consequence. It moved through paperwork and phone calls and the grinding authority of process rather than through corridors and ladders and voice memos sent under pressure. Kellerman was detained in the administrative corridor by building security and 2 federal agents 17 minutes after Caldwell received Jamie's recording. He did not resist. He stood with his hands at his sides and his expression arranged into the particular composure of a man who had decided that this moment was not the one to expend energy on, that the real work would happen later, through lawyers and institutional leverage and the considerable resources available to a deputy director who had spent 20 years accumulating both. What he hadn't fully accounted for was Harlan. Harlan, who had spent 2 hours in the stairwells and corridors of Hargrove Memorial Medical Center, reading things on his phone with the expression of a man watching a building he'd constructed turn out to have been built on bad ground. Harlan had been making his own calls. To the Oversight Committee directly. To 2 senators whose names Jamie didn't know, but whose involvement Caldwell mentioned in a clipped, careful sentence that communicated they were significant. To a legal officer in the Inspector General's office, whose jurisdiction covered exactly the kind of irregular authorization that had created Jamie's file in the first place. He came to room 14 at 7:40 a.m., after Greer had been stabilized and the troponin levels had come back elevated, but not critical. And Dr. Osei had ordered a repeat catheterization that would happen in the morning. He stood in the doorway with the look of a man who had arrived at a destination that he'd been avoiding for a long time. Kellerman is being processed, he said. Formal detention pending IG review. Denton was picked up at the building's South Service exit. A pause. The agent who followed him down the ladder has a sprained ankle. The tablet, Jamie said. Evidence. He looked at her steadily. The transmission didn't complete. Whatever Kellerman's people put on that server, the committee's IT team can compare it against the interrupted upload log and identify the discrepancy. And Greer's phone will be delivered to the committee directly, chain of custody established tonight. He was quiet for a moment. There's going to be an IG investigation, full review of the operational decisions made during the mission 7 years ago. The authorization for your status change. Everything. Another pause. It's going to take time. I know how these things work, Jamie said. Your record will be... He stopped, started again. You'll need to decide what you want it to look like. On the other side of this, there are people who will want you back. She looked at him. At the earnest, uncomfortable difficulty of his face, the face of a man who was trying to offer something and wasn't sure it was enough, which was probably the appropriate level of uncertainty. I have patients to check on, she said. He blinked. Voss? Harlan. I have been awake for 20 hours. I have a bruised shoulder, 4 patients I haven't properly documented, a medication error I caught and corrected in Dr. Phelps's orders that I need to address before I go off shift, and a charge nurse coming on at 7 a.m. who I owe a full handoff to. She looked at him. Whatever I want my record to look like on the other side of this, I'll think about it when I'm not responsible for 12 people's immediate medical welfare. He nodded slowly. Okay. Thank you, she said. For coming. I should have come sooner, he said. A lot sooner. She didn't agree or disagree. She went to do her chart documentation. Phelps was in the break room again when she came through at 8:05 a.m. He'd clearly been there a while, had coffee, had his coat properly on, had the look of a man who had spent the last several hours sitting with something and was still sitting with it. She poured coffee. She was going to need it for the drive home. The decimal error, he said. She waited. I've been thinking about it all night, he said. And I want to be honest with you, which is, I don't do that well. With nurses, I know I don't. He said this with the particular discomfort of someone who is accurate about themselves and finds the accuracy unwelcome. I dismissed things. I dismissed your concerns about the East Side patients initially. If you hadn't moved them, they would have been in significantly worse condition by 2 a.m., she said. Yes, I know. He looked at his coffee. I've looked at your documentation for the last 6 years, all of it. I pulled it this morning. His jaw moved. You've been right. Consistently. And I have been. He stopped. Not wrong exactly, but not listening the way I should have been. She drank her coffee. I'm not sure what I'm asking for, he said. An acknowledgement that I behaved badly. Or maybe just, you should know that I know. I know you know, she said. I've always known you knew. That was the part that made it hard. He looked up at her. Being dismissed by someone who knows better, she said, is a different thing than being dismissed by someone who genuinely doesn't see your value. One of them is ignorance. The other is a choice. She set down her coffee cup. I have a handoff to do. She left him in the break room with his coffee and his discomfort, which was exactly where he needed to be. The day shift charge nurse was a woman named Priya Anand, who had been with the unit for 11 years and who received Jamie's handoff with the focused attention of someone who understood that last night had been something well outside the ordinary and that the documentation in front of her was only part of the story. When Jamie finished, Priya looked up from the notes and said, Are you okay? I'll be okay, Jamie said. Right now, I'm tired. Go home, Priya said. I've got it. Jamie clipped off her badge and put it in her pocket. She gathered the few things she'd brought in. The keys, the gas station coffee cup she'd forgotten to throw away at the start of the shift, the jacket she'd hung on the back of the break room chair and retrieved while Phelps was still in there, because she'd been cold all night and had forgotten about the jacket until she remembered it. She was at the elevator when Caldwell appeared from the administrative corridor, with the particular efficiency of someone who had been waiting without appearing to wait. I need a formal statement at some point, Caldwell said. When you're rested. I know. The IG review. I know about the IG review, Harlan told me. Caldwell looked at her for a moment, then she said, The recording you sent, the one from the administrative corridor. She paused. Kellerman said something in it that we didn't expect. Which part? The part where he confirmed that the decision to alter your status was not fully authorized through standard channels, Caldwell said. He said it to you directly. He was trying to frame it as a justification, but the legal interpretation of what he said. She stopped. There are people in the IG's office who have been looking for that statement for 8 months. Greer's documentation supported it structurally, but Kellerman's direct admission on a recorded conversation. She exhaled. That's a different level of evidence. The elevator opened. Jamie looked at it. Go home, Caldwell said. Seriously, we'll call. Jamie stepped into the elevator. As the doors closed, she saw Brix, the Belgian Malinois, who had started everything 12 hours ago, being led through the lobby by his handler toward the exit, his stride still that same deliberate, certain walk. He was not looking at her. His work here was done. The doors shut. The elevator descended. And somewhere in the administrative offices above her, behind a closed door with 2 federal agents standing outside it, Aaron Kellerman sat with his lawyer's phone number dialed and his considerable composure in place, and the recording of his own voice saying words he'd believed were a private negotiation playing on a federal evidence server in an office she'd never see. She drove home in the gray morning light with the radio off. She was halfway there when she realized she still didn't know who had tipped Kellerman's people to the specific room Greer was in. Not the hospital, not the access logs. Those would show Kellerman's operative arriving with forged credentials, which had been the plan. But the room number. Greer was listed under a modified name in the system, a standard patient privacy protocol, the kind that kept journalists and uninvited family members from finding patients. To know he was in room 14, someone would have needed access to the unmodified admission record. She pulled over, sat for a moment. She'd told Phelps, early in the night, before any of this had unfolded, that Greer was in room 14. Not by name, but she'd referenced the room when she'd given him the patient census at the start of the shift. Standard handoff, room numbers, conditions, attending assignments. Phelps had arrived that night in response to a page. He'd arrived fast, fully dressed, which she'd attributed to the urgency of the situation. She sat with this for a long moment. She was tired. She could be wrong. She'd been awake for 20 hours, and her shoulder hurt, and her brain was running on coffee and adrenaline residue, and the particular frayed alertness of someone who'd been 3 steps ahead all night and was now sitting in a parked car on a gray Raleigh morning, wondering if the person who'd given her the most trouble for 6 years had given someone else something far more dangerous. She got out her phone. She called Caldwell. "One more thing," she said when Caldwell answered. "Greer's room number. I need you to pull the access log for the unmodified patient record and tell me everyone who looked at it in the last 48 hours. A pause. Then, "Give me 10 minutes. She sat in the parked car and waited. 7 minutes later, Caldwell called back. The name she said was not Phelps, it was Marcus. The name sat in the air of the parked car like something with physical weight. Marcus. She said nothing for a moment, just held the phone and let the name settle into the right place in her understanding, the way you let a dislocated joint settle, not without pain, but with the recognition that this is where it belongs. This is the true shape of the thing. "Tell me what the log shows," she said. Caldwell's voice was careful. The unmodified admission record for Greer was accessed twice in the last 48 hours outside of normal clinical workflow. Once by admissions at intake, which is standard, once at 11:52 p.m. last night from the nurses' station terminal on the ICU step-down unit. A pause. 8 minutes after the overnight shift started. 8 minutes after she'd arrived. While she was in report with Deb, while Marcus was at the station doing what the unit secretary always did at shift change, pulling up the census, updating the board, cross-referencing room assignments. He would have needed to know what to look for, Jamie said. Greer's modified name. He wouldn't have known to search for it unless someone told him the record existed and gave him the search parameters. "We're pulling his communication logs now," Caldwell said. "Personal phone records will take a subpoena, but his hospital-issued accounts, email, internal messaging. Those we can access immediately with the incident authorization." Another pause. Shorter. "Jamie, I'm sorry. I know he was—" "Do what you need to do," Jamie said. "I'll be available when you need a statement." She ended the call. She sat in the parked car on a gray Raleigh morning, and she thought about Marcus, 24 years old, 4 months on the unit, the kind of young man who remembered how everyone took their coffee and laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them, and had sat across from her at the nurses' station for the entirety of a night that had nearly killed multiple people. She thought about his face when she'd told him to pull the HVAC schematics. The way he'd gone pale. The way she'd read it as alarm at the situation and not at being asked to retrieve information he'd already known was relevant. She thought about what it costs someone to be recruited by people like Kellerman, what they offer, what they threaten, what a 24-year-old unit secretary with 4 months on the job and no institutional protection looks like to someone who has spent 20 years identifying and leveraging exactly that kind of vulnerability. She was not going to excuse it. 3 patients had been exposed to a chemical agent. Calloway had coded. Greer had spent the night in a room with someone trying to erase 8 months of his life. Whatever Marcus had been offered or threatened with, the outcomes of his choice had been real and had landed on people who deserved none of it. But she also knew, in the way that 20 hours of exhaustion makes certain truths harder to avoid, that Marcus had not built the system that made him useful. He had not designed the operation or authorized the chemical agent or created the conditions in which a young man with a hospital access terminal became a viable point of entry for something this serious. He had been a door that someone else had found and opened. That didn't change what he'd done. It changed how she felt about it. She pulled back onto the road and drove home. She slept for 6 hours. Not peacefully. She woke twice, once at the distant sound of a truck on the street outside, and once from something internal that had no external cause, the body's own alarm system running drills. But 6 hours was what she had before her phone started generating activity she couldn't ignore. The first call was from Caldwell at 3:15 p.m. Marcus had been brought in for questioning at 11 a.m. His hospital-issued email showed 3 messages over the past month from an address that resolved to a relay server, untraceable in the casual sense, traceable in the federal sense, containing what appeared to be a series of requests framed as information gathering. Benign questions at first: patient census logistics, unit staffing patterns, the kind of thing that could be rationalized as background research for something legitimate. Then, 6 days ago, a request for the room assignment of a specific patient admitted under a modified name, and a payment, not large, not dramatic, $3,000 moved through a platform that processed enough transactions daily to look like noise. Deposited into an account that Marcus had opened 2 months ago at a bank 2 neighborhoods from his apartment. "He's cooperating," Caldwell said. "Fully. He's been talking since 11 and he hasn't asked for a lawyer, which his public defender is going to be very unhappy about when she arrives." "What did they tell him it was for?" Jamie asked. "Insurance fraud investigation. They told him the patient in room 14 had filed fraudulent claims and that they were a private investigation firm contracted by the insurer." A beat. "He didn't know what the information was going to be used for. I want to be clear that that doesn't mitigate what happened." "I know," Jamie said, "but the DA's office will take it into account." She sat with that for a moment, thought about a 24-year-old who had believed a cover story because it was designed to be believed, who had been paid $3,000 to look up a room number and had had no mechanism to understand what that room number was going to be used for, who would now spend however long dealing with the consequences of a decision he'd made in 30 seconds for reasons that had seemed, in the moment, almost reasonable. "Make sure the DA knows he cooperated," she said, "immediately and fully." "I will," Caldwell said. The second call came at 4:30 p.m. from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She answered. The voice was a woman's, measured, professional, with the particular precision of someone who has been in high-level institutional conversations so long that even casual speech carries the cadence of prepared remarks. "Ms. Voss," she said, "my name is Irene Whitfield. I'm the chair of the Congressional Oversight Committee currently reviewing the operational records from the Delvane mission." Jamie sat up. "I understand you've had a significant 24 hours, Whitfield continued. "I'm not going to take much of your time today. I wanted you to hear directly from me that your recording from last night, Deputy Director Kellerman's direct admission regarding the authorization for your status modification, has been formally entered into the committee record. In addition, Walter Greer's documentation, delivered to our secure server this morning via chain of custody transfer from Agent Caldwell's team, is intact and verified." "And the tampered upload?" Jamie said. "Identified, flagged, and preserved as additional evidence of interference with federal proceedings." A pause. "Ms. Voss, we've been looking for the full picture of what happened in that operation for 8 months. What you did last night, the recording, the preservation of the tablet, the patient documentation that put the chemical agent on the record, has given us a complete case." Another pause, this one with something in it that was not quite official. "I also want to say, personally, that what was done to your record was wrong. The committee intends to address it formally." Jamie looked out the window of her apartment. The afternoon light was the specific flat gray of a Raleigh October, the kind that wasn't quite overcast and wasn't quite clear, sitting undecided between two states. "What does formally address it mean?" she said. "It means your service record will be corrected. Your status restored to honorable discharge, with the operational citations you earned prior to the Delvane mission reinstated." Whitfield's voice was careful. "It also means that certain people will face consequences. Kellerman's detention is the beginning, not the end." "I know how these things move," Jamie said. "Months, probably longer." "Yes," Whitfield said, "but they move. I want you to know that they will move." A brief pause. "Is there anything you need from the committee in the immediate term?" Jamie thought about that question for a genuine moment, not the reflexive deflection she might have offered. "I'm fine, just let the process run," but an actual consideration of what she needed. "My name," she said finally, "the name I've been using for 6 years. I need to know whether there's a legal process to formalize it, whether Jamie Voss can exist as a real identity and not just a constructed one." "There is a process," Whitfield said. "I'll have someone from our legal office contact you." The third call came at 6 p.m., and it was the one she hadn't expected. Phelps. She stared at his name on her screen for 4 rings and then answered, because not answering felt like the kind of thing she'd spent 6 years doing, the strategic retreat, the decision to avoid the friction, and she was tired of it. "I'm not calling about work," he said immediately, which was the most disorienting opening he could have chosen. "I want to say something, and I want to say it clearly, not in a break room at 5 a.m. when we're both running on empty." She waited. "I looked at your file today," he said. "The employment file. And I looked at the incident documentation from last night, which administration has been compiling since 7 a.m. And I spoke to Priya, who told me things I should have been told, or should have noticed, years ago." He stopped. "You have been the best clinician on my unit for 6 years, and I have spent 6 years behaving as though your observations required my endorsement to be valid. I was wrong about that. Not sometimes. Consistently." She was quiet. "3 patients were moved before the exposure became critical," he said. "Calloway survived because the crash cart was positioned before the power cut. The decimal error was caught before it reached the patient." His voice had the specific texture of a man dismantling something he'd built over a long time. "None of that was me." "You wrote good orders," she said, "most of the time." "That's a very generous construction," he said. "I'm tired," she said. "I don't have the energy for anything else." A short pause, then something that was not quite a laugh, closer to an exhale with rueful acknowledgement in it. "Fair enough. I wanted you to know, that's all." Another pause. "The federal people, they're coming back tomorrow to complete the investigation. If you need anything from me, a statement, anything, I'll say exactly what happened, exactly what I saw you do." "Thank you," she said. "It's the minimum," he said. "But yes." He ended the call. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Then she put it down and made herself dinner, which was eggs and leftover rice and the particular quiet of an apartment that had no emergency in it, and she sat at her table and ate and did not think about anything for 19 minutes, which was its own kind of achievement. The formal IG hearing convened 6 weeks later. Jamie had been given leave from Hargrove during the investigation, paid, which had required a specific intervention from the hospital's legal department after the initial HR instinct had been to treat the situation as a liability issue rather than an employee protection one. She'd spent the 6 weeks doing the things that getting your life corrected requires: meetings with the committee's legal office, a deposition that lasted 4 hours in a room with fluorescent lighting and bad coffee, 2 separate interviews with federal investigators who were competent and thorough and asked good questions that she answered completely. She also, during those 6 weeks, slept properly for the first time in what felt like a long time. Went running 3 mornings a week in the gray October light. Called a woman she'd been friendly with before the night of October 14th, a nurse from a different unit named Rosa, who'd texted twice during the leave to ask if she was okay, and had lunch with her and told her the parts of the story she was legally able to tell. And Rosa had listened with the focused attention of a good nurse and said, at the end, "So you saved the building and then went back to chart." "I hadn't finished the documentation," Jamie said. Rosa had looked at her for a moment and then laughed. Not at her, but at the specific absurdity of the thing, the way that genuine crisis eventually resolves back into paperwork, because paperwork is how the world maintains continuity. Jamie had laughed too. It surprised her. It felt like something unclenching. The IG hearing produced a public report 3 months after the incident. She read it in her apartment on a Thursday morning with coffee that was better than gas station coffee, because she'd bought a decent machine in November and it had turned out to matter more than she'd expected for daily quality of life. The report was thorough. It named Kellerman directly, not euphemistically, not with the institutional softening that these documents sometimes employed, but with the specific language of someone who had authorized the fraudulent alteration of a service member's official record, directed a covert operation against a civilian medical facility, and taken deliberate steps to obstruct a congressional investigation. It named the operation that had preceded everything. It named Harlan, with the specific and important distinction that his authorization for her status change had been obtained under false pretenses by Kellerman, and that his own cooperation with the investigation had been complete and immediate once he'd understood the full scope. It named her, not as a victim, or not only as that, as the person whose actions during the incident at Hargrove Memorial Medical Center had preserved evidence, protected patients, and created the evidentiary foundation that made the subsequent investigation possible. She read that paragraph twice, not because she needed the validation. She'd been a good nurse for 6 years without a report saying so, and she'd been a good medic for 3 years before that, and neither of those things had required external confirmation to be true. She read it twice because she'd spent 6 years being someone whose observations required endorsement to be valid. Phelps' phrase, accurate and uncomfortable. And there was something specific and real about having a federal document state plainly that she had seen what she'd seen, done what she'd done, and been right. Kellerman was indicted on 7 counts. The trial would take a year, probably longer. These things always did. But the indictment was specific and well-supported, and the legal office that had called her after Whitfield's conversation had been quietly clear that the evidentiary foundation was stronger than most cases of this type ever achieved. Denton pled guilty to federal obstruction charges in December. His cooperation agreement required him to testify against Kellerman, which he did, and the testimony covered things that had not been in Greer's documentation, operational details, communications, specific decisions made in specific rooms by specific people that expanded the scope of the investigation significantly. Marcus was charged with 1 count of unauthorized access to protected health information and 1 count of wire fraud. He pled guilty. His sentence was 18 months of probation, community service, and a permanent bar from working in any capacity that involved access to protected personal data. He was 24 years old. He had, in the words of his public defender, been manipulated by people with vastly more experience at manipulation than he had at recognizing it. The judge took note of his immediate cooperation and the absence of any prior record. Jamie had written a letter to the court. Not a letter of forgiveness. She wasn't sure that was hers to give, given that the harm had fallen on patients she'd been responsible for. But a letter of context. What she'd observed of him during 4 months of working alongside him. The specific ways in which the people who'd recruited him had been expert at finding and exploiting exactly his kind of inexperience. The fact that when the moment of real consequence arrived, he'd told the truth completely and immediately, without negotiation. She didn't know if it helped. She sent it anyway. She went back to Hargrove in January, not because she had to. The committee's legal office had made clear that several options were available to her: consulting roles, positions with federal health agencies, a general landscape of doors that had opened in the wake of the investigation and the restored record in the public report. She'd considered them, had sat with each one long enough to understand what it would feel like to walk through it. She went back to Hargrove because her patients were there. Mrs. Tamboli had sent a card to the unit in November. She'd addressed it to the night nurse who moved my room. She didn't have a name to put on it, had addressed it generally, and Priya had put it on the bulletin board above the nursing station where it had stayed through November and December and was still there when Jamie came back in January. It said, in the careful handwriting of a 68-year-old woman who'd survived a cardiac event, "I don't know if you'll see this. I want you to know I understood what you did that night, even if no one explained it properly. Thank you for paying attention." She stood in front of it for a moment on her first day back. Then she clipped on her badge and started her rounds. The unit had changed in small ways. A new aide replacing Marcus, a scheduling adjustment Priya had implemented while she was out, a different system for the medication cart that had been introduced hospital-wide in December. She adapted to the changes the way she adapted to everything, by learning them precisely and quickly and without making a production of the adjustment. Phelps she saw on her 3rd day back. They were at the medication station, running simultaneously, and it was slightly awkward in the way that interactions are awkward when someone has said something true and difficult and neither person has found the appropriate follow-on behavior yet. He handed her a chart she'd reached for at the same moment he did. She took it. Their eyes met briefly. "Good to have you back," he said. "Thank you," she said. That was the whole of it. It wasn't resolution in the dramatic sense. No speech, no transformation, no guarantee that he wouldn't lapse back into old habits or that she wouldn't have to navigate the same friction again. He was who he was, and she was who she was, and they were both human enough to make the same mistakes twice and self-aware enough to be at least somewhat embarrassed about it. But something had shifted. Not in him, necessarily. In the dynamic, in the space between them, in the unspoken understanding of what had been established about who she was and what she was worth. Some things, once known, cannot be fully unknown. He had looked at her documentation, had seen what she'd been doing for 6 years inside the architecture of his dismissal, and whatever he did with that going forward, That was his problem to work out. She had her own work. Greer was discharged from Hargrove in late October, after the repeat catheterization and a recovery that the cardiac team described as remarkable, and that Jamie privately attributed to stubbornness, which in her experience was a vastly underrated recovery tool. He'd sent her one message 2 weeks after discharge. No preamble, just 8 months of work. You kept it alive. Thank you. She'd read it and then set it aside, because there wasn't really an adequate response to it, and she wasn't someone who performed gratitude exchanges well. But she'd thought about what 8 months of work meant, accumulated slowly in the memory of a phone while the world tried to erase it. The specific human refusal to let important things stay buried. She understood that refusal, had been living it for 6 years without calling it that. Harlan she spoke to once more in February, in a phone call he'd initiated to tell her that her service record correction had been finalized and that her discharge status had been formally changed in the official registry. No ceremony, no letter. Just a fact, stated plainly, in the voice of a man who knew that plain stating was the minimum owed. There will be citations reinstated formally in the spring, he said. If you want them. I'll think about it, she said. Voss? He stopped. Started again. Jamie, for what it's worth, what I saw you do that night, the patients, the building, the evidence, all of it, under conditions that would have broken most people. He stopped again. I'm sorry it took 7 years and a federal incident for anyone to see it properly. She thought about that for a moment. It wasn't invisible, she said finally. It was just inconvenient. There's a difference. A pause. The people it was inconvenient for were looking at the wrong things. That's their failure, not mine. A long quiet on the line. Yes, Harlan said. That's exactly right. Look, she was on a Saturday evening shift in March when Caldwell came through the ER doors. Not in her federal gear, not in the dark jacket with the agency credentials, but in a regular coat with the off-duty quality of someone who'd driven somewhere for a reason that wasn't official. Jamie saw her from the nurse's station and waited. Caldwell came to the station, looked at the unit, at the controlled, purposeful activity of a functioning hospital floor, the monitors, the ordered motion, the specific dignity of people doing careful work in the service of other people's survival. Kellerman's trial date was set this morning, she said, March of next year. The prosecution's case is... She shook her head slightly. Strong is an understatement. Good, Jamie said. I thought you'd want to know directly. I appreciate it. Caldwell looked at her for a moment. Then she said, Can I ask you something? Yes. You had the voice memo running before he said anything incriminating, before he admitted anything. You started the recording when I told you he was asking for you by name. She looked at her steadily. You knew he would say something he shouldn't. I thought he might, Jamie said. Kellerman is a man who has been the most powerful person in every room he's been in for 20 years. When he finally has the conversation he's been managing toward all night, he's going to explain himself. Not because he's careless, because he believes the explanation is compelling enough to work. And you let him explain. I asked good questions, Jamie said. He did the rest. Caldwell looked at her for another moment. The particular assessment of someone revising their understanding of events they thought they'd already understood completely. Okay, she said. Then, thank you for what you did that night. I know that's inadequate. It's fine, Jamie said. It was my building. Caldwell left. Jamie went back to her rounds. There's a thing that happens to people who have spent significant time being seen as less than they are. A specific internal accommodation, like a joint that heals slightly wrong after an injury. It works. It holds weight. But there's always a place where the old damage lives, and some mornings you feel it more than others. She felt it sometimes. Still, in small moments, when a new physician talked over her in rounds, when a family member looked past her to find someone with a different title, when the automatic assumption landed that she was support and not substance. She felt the old accommodation activate, the learned patience that had kept her functional for 6 years inside a structure that didn't fully see her. The difference now was that she knew it for what it was. Not a permanent truth about her value. Just friction. Just the ongoing work of being a person in a world that is constantly making incorrect assumptions and having to be corrected. She was good at correction. She'd been doing it for 6 years without anyone noticing. She noticed now. On a Thursday in April, she was on a mid-shift when a new nurse was oriented to the unit. A young woman named Dara, 26 years old, 12 weeks out of her program, smart and nervous in equal measure, with the particular alertness of someone trying to absorb everything simultaneously. Jamie was assigned to mentor her for the first 4 weeks. They were at the medication station at hour 3 of the shift when Dara flagged something in a patient's chart. A small thing. A potential interaction between two medications that had both been ordered independently by different physicians and hadn't been cross-checked. She flagged it tentatively, in the way that new nurses flag things when they're not sure whether their observation is worth saying out loud. "Say it clearly," Jamie said. Dara blinked. "What?" "Whatever you just noticed. Say it like you know what you saw, because you do." Dara straightened slightly, stated the observation. She was right. She'd caught a real interaction, one that could have caused a problem if it had gone to the patient unchecked. Jamie walked her through the process of flagging it formally, through the right channel, in documentation language that couldn't be dismissed or overlooked. "Does it always work?" Dara asked. "Documenting things. Does it actually change anything?" Jamie thought about 6 years of charge notes and shift reports and careful paper trails built in the shadow of a structure that had kept telling her, in 100 small ways, that her judgment required someone else's signature to be real. "Not always immediately," she said, "but it builds. Everything you see clearly and write down accurately. It accumulates." She looked at the chart. "And then one day, it matters in a way you weren't expecting, and you'll be glad it's there." Dara nodded, filed the flag. Watched it generate an alert that pulled the prescribing physician's attention within 6 minutes, resulting in an order modification that would protect a patient who would never know anyone had been paying attention. Which was, Jamie thought, exactly how it was supposed to work. Not with spotlights. Not with the kind of recognition that required an audience. Just with the daily, unremarkable commitment of someone who noticed things and refused to let the noticing be talked out of them. Someone who understood that the work was the point, that the work had always been the point, and that the value of it didn't require anyone's endorsement to be real. She'd known that, she thought, before any of this, had kept knowing it through 6 years of being treated like she didn't. That was the thing nobody had managed to take from her. Not Kellerman, not the mission, not the altered record, not the name that wasn't hers, not the physician who'd spent 6 years treating her observations like optional input. None of it had touched the part of her that knew what she saw and trusted herself to see it. She finished her shift at 7 p.m., did her handoff, changed out of her scrubs, walked out through the main entrance into the April evening, where the air was finally doing what April air is supposed to do, turning toward warmth, carrying something green in it, the particular smell of a season that has decided to commit. She didn't look back at the building. She didn't need to. She was coming back tomorrow, and the day after that, because this was her floor and her patients and her work, and it had been, through everything, the one thing that was entirely and completely hers. That was enough. That was, it turned out, exactly enough.